it was in February 2017, just 1 month into Trump's term, that the Atlanta Council began its social media censorship world tour. The Atlanta Council gets annual funding from all four branches of the U.S. military, the Air Force, the Navy, the Army, and the Marines. It gets funding from the State Department. It gets funding from CIA cutouts like the National Endowment for Democracy. It has 7 former CIA chiefs on its board of directors, but it was threatened by the Trump administration because it had a private cooperation agreement with Burisma, the Biden family's natural gas company, essentially, if you will, in Ukraine, and they were threatened by Trump's foreign policy, potentially cutting off oxygen to the ongoing coup that the Pentagon and the UK Foreign Office were waging in Ukraine.
Welcome to another episode of Counterculture, the show that stands at the intersection of reason and faith in the battle against sentimentality. What is the censorship industrial complex? How does it work? And how can it be stopped? One might think that Americans who believe in free minds and free expression would be more exercised about the revelations published in the Twitter files documenting the collusion between federal and state governments and social media platforms to manipulate political speech online. One might think Republicans would take judicial notice of Harvard-educated psychologist Robert Epstein, whose research suggested that Google's rigging of its search results pushed between 2.5 and 10.5 million votes to Hillary Clinton in the 2016 presidential election. Epstein has since continued to warn about the information engineering of search engines like Google and social media platforms like Facebook. One might think these things, but so far one would be wrong, largely. Epstein's recommendations have not been adopted. Efforts to repeal Section 230 protections for social media platforms haven't gone anywhere. Perhaps they shouldn't. The complaints continue, but so does the censorship industrial complex's push to solidify its position as the arbiter of what can be communicated. As our guest on this edition of Counterculture has described, in anticipation of SCOTUS's decision in the Missouri v. Biden case, the powers that be, and want to be, are already taking evasive action to perpetuate their positions as our information overlords. If information is indeed power, attention should be paid to how much power is concentrated in how few hands, right? Mike Benz is a former State Department official and founder of the Foundation for Freedom Online, an organization dedicated to restoring the promise of a free and open internet. Benz's research has been influential in piecing together the unconstitutional collaboration between big government and big tech, and that's according to Michael Shellenberger, one of the lead reporters in the Twitter files investigation. And Benz joins us now. Mike Benz, welcome. Thank you.
Thanks for having me.
Well, I just want to, go through this progression from your perspective. You heard me mention Robert Epstein and his assessment of what happened in 2016, and that was before ostensibly Google and many of these social media platforms were even trying very hard because they didn't anticipate that Hillary Clinton would lose to Donald Trump. And we go from 16 to the infrastructure they built in 20, which you have spoken a lot about. So has Matt Taibbi and Michael Shellenberger. And then now 2024 with the with NewsGuard and what they're attempting to do in advance of the Missouri v. Biden administration, so they can continue the work that they've set upon over the last 7 to 8 years now. So I want to understand the progression, make sure we're not missing anything. So, can you give us your perspective on how this proceeded from Trump's election to where we find ourselves today generally, and then we'll dig into the specifics?
Yeah, so you had Trump's election in November 2016. The censorship industry really started a couple of years before that. In 2014, when you had the Crimea annexation and the sort of Russia backstopped counter coup in Maidan in Ukraine in 2014, you had the military industrial complex, the Pentagon, the State Department, the CIA, the intelligence services, both on the US side and on the Europe side, begin to see information as a military domain. NATO declared this doctrine of from tanks to tweets. And then, so you already had a portion of what we often refer to as the American deep state tilting towards building censorship capacities and censorship interlinkages with the tech companies from 2014 to 2016. When Brexit happened and then Trump was elected, this hit the gas basically. It all exploded and came westward to the U.S. Immediately, the linchpin in 2016 was RussiaGate. The idea, this CIA concocted lie that Russia had materially interfered with the U.S. presidential election and tilted it for Trump. This was something that was used as the foreign policy and national security predicate to create the initial censorship infrastructure. Most people think about RussiaGate as being the Mueller investigation on the FBI side. That's just the tip of the iceberg. I mean, really, RussiaGate's lingering damage was that it provided the predicate to create this massive censorship laundering system with the national security agencies, with the federal government, and with the tech companies, ostensibly to stop a hostile foreign nation state from influencing American hearts and minds. When RussiaGate fell apart in 2019, in that summer, when Mueller took the stand and had nothing, all of that censorship infrastructure, all that collaboration between the tech companies and the CIA, the tech companies and the State Department, the tech companies and DHS, FBI, the Pentagon, the National Science Foundation, HHS, you name it, all of that was redirected from foreign disinformation to domestic disinformation. And they initially basically described this as a cybersecurity threat. This is all they had at the time. They basically likened it to hacking hearts and minds, that just like our cybersecurity agencies deal with hacking threats from Iran or North Korea, now suddenly they were dealing with sort of psychological hacking threats. And so we had these permanent government bureaucracies created, starting inside DHS, but then metastasizing throughout the whole federal government between 2019 and 2020, that continued to have this coercive relationship, putting their boot on the neck of the tech platforms. It really wasn't until 2022. I mean, that continued exponentially from 2019 to 2022 with this domestic censorship infrastructure. And then you had a series of sort of free speech counteroffensive successes. You had the Disinformation Governance Board getting crushed within a week. Suddenly, the sort of sleeping giant of political awakeness, if you will, happened with Chuck Grassley's committee and Josh Hawley, and there was sort of coordinated pressure to kill that. Then you had Elon Musk in short order announcing his acquisition of Twitter. Then you had the House turning over from Democrat to Republican. This allowed all the investigations and hearings that continued for the past 18 months. That also assisted the Twitter files, because suddenly the Twitter files could actually have a congressional hearing as well. So, we have a lot of momentum right now. The issue is the empire is striking back.
So just going back to that period, 2016 to 2020 is basically Trump's term. So after Russia inclusion, all that stuff that was happening at that time that we were fighting, it felt like we were fighting tactics that social media companies were using, whether it was shadow banning or just straight up deplatforming, banning outright, like Trump ultimately was banned from Twitter, right? I mean, that period and some of what we saw there in terms of the beginnings of next phase manipulation of information, is that what we should have been thinking about, realizing what was happening, or did we miss something else during that period that turned out to be critical when they took it next level with the Election Integrity Project, which we'll get to?
Yes. I mean, certainly that was missed at the White House level. I was screaming about it pretty much every day, for the past 7 years. I mean, this was all available for anyone with eyes to see, open source, if you were in the right place at the right time. They were having these conversations openly. That is the blob apparatchiks, the folks from the Pentagon, the State Department, and the IC, talking about the need to stop domestic mis and disinformation as early as 2017, with that first term. In fact, it was in February 2017, just 1 month into Trump's term that the Atlanta Council began its social media censorship world tour. The Atlanta Council gets annual funding from all four branches of the U.S. military. The Air Force, the Navy, the Army, and the Marines. It gets funding from the State Department. It gets funding from CIA cutouts like the National Endowment for Democracy. It has 7 former CIA chiefs on its board of directors. But it was threatened by the Trump administration because it had a private cooperation agreement with Burisma, the Biden family's natural gas company, essentially, if you will, in Ukraine. And they were threatened by Trump's foreign policy, potentially cutting off oxygen to the ongoing coup that the Pentagon and the UK Foreign Office were waging in Ukraine. If you remember, the 2019 impeachment of Trump was also a Pentagon CIA affair. It was a Pentagon official in the form of Vindman, and it was a CIA guy in the form of Eric Ciamarella that orchestrated in cahoots with a State Department cabal with Yovanovitch and those folks and George Kent to pull off that impeachment. I mean, everything that Trump was under threat by was around this foreign policy blob that was the architect of the censorship infrastructure we now have. And this is a really important point. Most people think of domestic censorship as being controlled by domestic organizations. It's not. I mean, they may be parked domestically, but these are globalist organizations. These are foreign policy organizations. Organizations like the Atlanta Council I just mentioned, or like Graphica, which is a Pentagon cutout, which is part of that election integrity partnership you mentioned, or like Stanford University, which is run by Michael McFaul, the Obama's ambassador to Russia, and which is run at the operational level by Renee DiResta, who started her career in the CIA. It is all the foreign-facing Department of Dirty Tricks who is controlling domestic censorship. This is exactly what Eisenhower warned about in the 50s and 60s. It's what Truman, who set up the CIA, warned about after he left office when he wrote an op-ed saying that if he knew the CIA would end up this way, he would have never created it. He would have never signed it by pen stroke. We empowered this blob to do dirty tricks abroad, to overthrow governments and to rig media ecosystems on every plot of dirt in the world. The whole catch was it was never supposed to come home. And now not only has it come home, it has built a beaver dam, it has built a bird's nest, it has declared a permanent home. And if it's not stopped now, we're never going to stop it.
So our Frankenstein, and those are not just internationally facing organizations, but importantly, they're government funded largely. And this is where we get to this, the four horsemen organizations with respect to the Election Integrity Project. And I want you to develop that for us. We've done some talking about it, and you've done a lot of talking about it, which is how people are getting a better understanding of this. But Stanford University, University of Washington, Graphica, and the Atlanta Council, and their service as a cutout to get to do through the back door what Department of Homeland Security and the rest of these alphabet soup national security law enforcement agencies couldn't do through the front door.
That's exactly right. So you had this never Trump cabal within the Department of Homeland Security. By the way, I'm not even saying this to be partisan. If it was a Bernie Sanders who had won, they would have done a deep state coup from the populist left. I mean, they're sensitive about their right populist flank and their left populist flank. But basically, you had this early period in 2020 where they were afraid Trump was going to win the election. And they decided they needed to rig social media because Trump won in 2016 on the basis of his social media strength. And so you had this foreign policy cutout coup within this cybersecurity, this obscure little cybersecurity sub-agency within DHS. This is what we just talked about in the previous segment. They defined social media posts, if they contain misinformation, as being an attack on critical infrastructure of the U.S. federal government, because they defined elections to be critical infrastructure. So this little cybersecurity sub-agency called CISA, it developed long-arm jurisdiction over your opinions about the election on social media by saying if you speak misinformation about mail-in ballots, if you say that they are not safe and effective, then you are committing a cyber attack on the critical infrastructure of American elections. And so DHS has the ability to censor you. Now, they knew they couldn't pull this off directly because of the First Amendment. And in fact, the head of the IP, Alex Stamos, is on tape, and my foundation, Foundation for Freedom Online, ended up catching this and clipping it, saying that DHS at the time knew that they lacked the legal authorization to censor directly. So they set up EIP in order to fill the gaps of what the government could not do itself. And so you had these outside organizations that were given not just federal funding in large part. The Atlanta Council, the Digital and Graphica are both federally funded. Both the universities involved, Stanford and UW, ended up getting a joint $3 million grant shortly after the election. They essentially got paid off for getting the administration into office. And what they did is DHS worked closely with this outside cutout consortium of those four entities in order to get essentially hundreds of millions of posts and tens of thousands of accounts either banned or throttled. This massively rigged the entire election cycle because it started in June 2020. They got 22 million tweets labeled misinformation because they bragged on tape about coercing the tech companies through inducing crisis PR and threatening to have the government break them up on both antitrust and other regulatory grounds if they did not censor Trump supporters ahead of the 2020 election. Now, they didn't use the phrase Trump supporters. They said anyone who questions mail-in ballots, anyone who talks about ballot harvesting, anyone who talks about ballot trafficking, and anyone who's got a problem with vote tabulation on election day. I mean, this is the perfect cover-up if you were doing dirty deeds, by the way. They basically had the people, in charge of administering the election were also in charge of censoring all questions about the administration of the election. If this happened in a third world country, the State Department would immediately pass international sanctions on such a country and declare its elections to be invalid. But this was architected within the bowels of our own Department of Homeland Security, who, as a final note, I should add, was deliberately set up to model a domestic CIA. The Stanford Internet Observatory's Renee DiResta, who started her career in the CIA and they were the primary leader of the EIP partnership, bragged on tape at a DHS disinformation conference shortly after the election that they knew that they couldn't set up a DHS censorship cell inside the CIA because the CIA is foreign facing. And they couldn't do it within the FBI because the FBI requires a law-breaking predicate because it's attached to the Justice Department. So they created they gave DHS the foreign-facing dirty tricks powers of the CIA with the domestic jurisdiction of the FBI, but evading the FBI restrictions by putting it at DHS. So this whole thing was orchestrated top to bottom. They knew it was dirty from Jump Street, and now they're getting caught. But the question is there political will to hold them accountable?
Yeah, so a couple of things there too. Talking about the throttling of information that didn't comport with the orthodoxy about mail-in ballots or anything else election related. Just to remind people, that also included, we know this from the Twitter files as well, that also included any disagreement with orthodoxy coming from public health agencies about COVID, even though so much of it turned out to be inaccurate. So, I mean, it's not just the election. I mean, their scope is broad, and it seems like to me they use everything they can under the rubric of protecting our democracy to insinuate themselves into other issues that could have political implications. The other thing I just wanted to say one more thing too. You mentioned this. Look, leftist populism. Somebody like Bernie Sanders would have been elected, then you would have seen something akin to this as well. Also, I just want to make this point. I mentioned Shellenberger at the outset, who's given you credit for the research that he's relied on in his reporting, your research. And Matt Taibbi, too. These are two of the leading journalists that have done the Twitter files reporting, been entrusted by Musk to do so. I mean, these are both men of the left. These are not Trump supporters. So this is not some sort of Trump fantasy, black helicopter situation that's being perpetuated by the vast right-wing conspiracy. These are journalists that I guess, in a sense, are classical men of the left who actually believe in the tenets of a free society, including a free press, and don't like to be lied to by the state and don't like the Orwellian track that the state has taken. And they're just providing all the evidence to support the claims that are being made and much of what you're describing.
No, that's exactly right. And actually, just to sort of ratify what you said about it's not just being about election censorship, that same organization that we just talked about, EIP, the Election Integrity Partnership, with Stanford, UW, Graphica, and the Atlanta Council, all serving as a government cutout for the Department of Homeland Security, when the 2020 election ended, and they're on tape bragging about this at a DHS conference, as soon as the election ended, they folded up shop, but then restarted with the exact same four entities, Stanford, UW, Graphica, and the Atlanta Council, except instead of calling themselves the Election Integrity Partnership to censor elections, they called themselves the Virality Project to censor COVID dissent. That is, anything about masks being effective, anything about vaccines being effective, anything challenging mandates, and anything comprising so-called conspiracy theories about Bill Gates or Tony Fauci or these folks. In fact, one of those organizations, Graphica, actually started COVID censorship right out the gate as early as January 2020, just 1 month after the outbreak even occurred. And this again is they teamed up with NATO's Stratcom, the psychological warfare outfit of NATO. And this makes sense because Graphica itself started out as being a product of the Minerva Initiative, which is the Department of Defense's proprietary psychological operations research unit. So they basically had an organization devoted to brainwashing foreign populations, do the initial sweep of all COVID dissent worldwide in the US, in the UK, in Italy. They put out this whole report in April 2020 talking about how just 1 month after the outbreak in January 2020, they monitored the entire internet for lab leak conspiracies and for anything that might indict the Pentagon or the US or UK governments in the role of the COVID outbreak. So you had a military operation to censor the internet right out the gate. And then as soon as they were done censoring the 2020 election, they created this full 120-person censorship consortium purely dedicated to monitoring emerging narratives about COVID heterodoxy and censoring them at scale in tandem with the federal government.
And so, I mean, what did the political class know about this? I mean, there's got to be. I mean, there's people like Rand Paul. I'm surprised that this was not more central to the conversation about the sort of public opinion manipulation that was being attempted here, regardless of the underlying truth of what a lot of these individuals were saying, whether it be about election integrity or the pandemic.
Well, the GOP is torn in the middle of a civil war right now, and that civil war is going to rage for years. And this makes them almost entirely ineffective at political solutions for combating things like censorship. I mean, we are just 2 days out from the GOP funding a $300 million expansion of FBI headquarters, while the FBI is indicting basically every key constituent for the GOP frontrunner in the current election. I mean, just as the GOP is essentially funding its own indictments, it's also subsidizing its own censorship. Now, this is happening because the GOP traditional power base is attached to the blob. You know, Trump didn't just defeat the Clinton dynasty in 2016. He defeated the Bush dynasty, the Bushes, the Cheneys, the McCains, the Romneys. All of this is attached to this vast Pentagon, State Department, CIA architecture dating back to the 1940s with Truman, especially with Eisenhower and Nixon in the 1950s. The power base of the Republican Party is around the Houston energy mafia and the oil intelligence field. And this apple cart was essentially upset by Trump's position on military neutrality, essentially, the first president in 40 years not to declare a new war. Also scaled back a number of democracy programs, which is just U.S. taxpayers paying to overthrow foreign countries that the blob doesn't like. Also, a number of things focused on domestic populism as opposed to international globalism. So the blob, that's half of it is comprised of the GOP. So you have a lot of very well-meaning congressmen and senators who are stuck between a rock and a hard place. They don't like domestic censorship, but they don't want to go up against the Atlantic Council. They don't want to go up against their own Pentagon. They don't want to go up against their own FBI.
I want to go back to the election integrity partnership in the 2020 cycle and subsequent, because one of the other pieces of this, I mean, I just want to sort of give people as good an idea as we can in terms of this architecture that you're talking about. And one of the aspects of it, as I understand, was setting up a state and local portal so that you could have misinformation, alleged misinformation from election authorities, funnel up to the feds, and you create this sort of whole, like, I don't know, I mean, I don't want to be over the top, but sort of Stasi network of public officials at your federal, it's literally federalism, right? Federal, state, and local infrastructure to report up and capture as much information they call misinformation, I might call disagreement, to be censored as possible.
No, that's exactly right. So we talked about CISA, this obscure little cybersecurity center within DHS that was set up to stop Russian hacking and ended up being deployed to mass censor perfectly lawful U.S. opinions about the election, millions at a time, essentially crushing all pro-Trump sentiment online through an obscure little cybersecurity agency. They ran something that they called their 24/7 Cyber Mission Control Center, which had within it a domestic disinformation switchboard. Now, on January 6, 2017, DHS declared elections to be critical infrastructure, effectively federalizing the administration of elections for the first time in 250 years. And one of the things that they did there is they created this permanent partnership between DHS, between CISA, this newly created organization within DHS, and the state Secretary of State offices in, I think, 49 of the 50 states. And so what they did is they worked with the Never Trump Republicans who wanted Biden to win because Biden was the foreign policy blob's pick, worked with the Democrat state secretaries of state in all the battleground states. And this is what it was in Arizona. This is what it was in Michigan and Wisconsin, all over. And sometimes when there wasn't a Democrat state secretary of state, there would be a Never Trump one. Like you had the situation in Arizona with Bill Gates and Steve Richter, not Bill Gates, the billionaire, Bill Gates, the county recorder.
Yeah.
And so what they did is they created these local, state and local censorship mercenary armies within the state secretary of state offices of all the battleground states. And they did this months before the election. Again, in June 2020, DHS held these private censorship instructional briefings for how these offices could use DHS's special domestic disinformation switchboard, which would super accelerate their attempts to mass report their political opponents. If you and I were to file a report against, a Hillary Clinton tweet or, a David Brock, some crazy guy on Twitter and say, we don't like this tweet, Twitter, you should take it down. It could take weeks or months for Twitter to even evaluate that post. Not so with the special domestic disinformation switchboard, which switchboarded directly into the top decision-making liaison offices for all of the trust and safety teams on every single social media platform: YouTube, Twitter, Facebook, TikTok. They even had the obscure ones like Twitch and Discord. So all of this could be mass reported. You had EIP doing the scan and ban type stuff. What are the emerging narratives? Oh, they're saying that a batch of ballots was just found in a ditch in Pennsylvania. Okay, so now the Pennsylvania State Secretaries of State's office is going to activate and mass report everything under this hashtag and all the leading accounts, which might have 1 million followers that were all taken offline. And they're going to use the federal government's own funded and operated domestic disinformation switchboard to get a special privilege badge to get that thing immediately yeeted. I mean, this is government funded, government operated, and even government privileged censorship capacities to censor who the deep wing of the government didn't want to be elected in that election cycle.
And so when you think about the 2020 election, all this stuff that's laid out, I mean, most of the focus has been on Zucker boxes, the vote by mail programs, sort of the traditional, if you will, although some of it was quite untraditional, but the traditional election infrastructure, stuff that you can see, personnel in election offices and so forth. But as you describe all this, what's your conclusion about what was most impactful on the outcome of the 2020 election? Was it this censorship industrial complex, or was it the vote by mail programs and the other argument, the other aspects of the administration of the election that are most commonly talked about?
It's the social media one by far, because I don't think you would have even necessarily been able to pass those mail-in ballot regs at the state level if pressure was allowed to be put on social media. They were very deliberate about this. And let me just say this so there's no ambiguity about this. In EIP's own reports, they talked about the necessity of censoring opposition narratives about mail-in ballots, because if people were allowed to put political pressure on their local representatives, on their state and local representatives, then they might not even be able to get these things essentially mass installed at the state level. They talked about the same thing in COVID. In fact, in their after action report for COVID, they described a failing to stop an Ohio State Assembly law which banned vaccine mandates in the state of Ohio. This is, Jim Jordan's jurisdiction, state, and Ohio at the time. All these universities were mandating vaccines, in Ohio, to protect their own people from vaccine mandates, passed this state law. And EIP described how they failed to sufficiently censor the people of Ohio that they could get the message out and put the pressure on their own representatives to get this passed, and next time they'll do better. And they knew this because Renee DiResta from the Stanford Internet Observatory, again, the sort of top operative at the operations level of EIP, gave a talk in 2017 about how political decisions are downstream of social media pressure. So if you can stop the social media pressure, you can stop the state level. And at the time, she gave a whole speech at Google called "The Inmates Are Running the Asylum." And it was about the problems of how Facebook pages of local concerned moms in California had stopped vaccine mandates at local California schools by creating these Facebook groups and creating social media hashtags and pressure at the state and county level on California governance folks. And so as a result of that, they leveraged social media to stop a vaccine program that Renee DiResta was championing. And so she took that very special set of skills of killing social media virality in order to kill the downstream political viability straight into the 2020 election with a long arm assist from the federal government itself.
A very special set of skills. She sounds like the Liam Neeson of censorship. But I mean, what you're describing is, I know, accurate. And again, some of the stuff you were talking about over the summer, laying this all out, has now been confirmed in the House Weaponization of Government Committee's report that Matt Taibbi just went over recently, drilling all it down. And he was referencing some of the very stories, like that Washington Post story about academics calling out Trump for his lies, allegedly, and so forth. He was drilling down on that story just like you were back in June, I think. So, I mean, this is what you're dealing with. So now that we have Missouri v. Biden, as I sort of telegraphed at the outset, and the Supreme Court likely to weigh in and rebuke the federal government for this collusion with social media companies, again, doing through private actors what they can't do themselves, which is unconstitutional. Now we've got the restructuring that you most recently talked about going on. So tell us about that restructuring and what was done with the Election Integrity Project, EIP, in 2020, and that consortium of organizations we've discussed. How does that metamorphosize into NewsGuard or some other middleware operator that will do in 2024, I guess in real time now and into 2024, what EIP did in advance of 2020?
Yes, so they are in the process of restructuring the censorship industry from being a top-down, government-controlled thing to a middle-out, government-sponsored, non-governmental organization mediated thing, if you will. So rather than having DHS set up government cutouts, they will have these government coordinated middleware organizations. Middleware means they sit in the middle between the platform and the user. And they're going to try to use a combination of regulations and mandatory disinformation compliance to create this propped up middleware market. So again, the way middleware would work is the government, they're afraid that they because of restrictions around the First Amendment, the government can't just tell companies what to censor, and they might not even be allowed to apply the same level of pressure and jawboning that they did in years past because of prohibitions on pass-throughs that might come from this Missouri v. Biden case. If the Missouri v. Biden case ends up with a home run ruling on EIP and CISA, it could be the case that they could be banned from using these direct cutouts, from creating them the way DHS did for the 2020 election. So in that case, what they're going to do, and they've already started restructuring around this, is having these middleware companies, which again, instead of having the platform do the censorship and the users being censored, and so you have this direct relationship from the platforms censoring the users, the platforms would be mediated by this new layer in the middle that's being called middleware, to give it a nice little Orwellian name so that plebs have no idea, their eyes glaze over. The name sounds too technical and jargony for you to, you're easily hypnotized. You think, oh, how bad could middleware be? It would have a more atrocious name if it was really that daunting. But that's what it is. So you talked about NewsGuard. NewsGuard is not a private entity. NewsGuard was essentially concocted by the national security state as a censorship solution in 2018. You had State Department funded organizations. You had the Atlanta Council, and you had these D4, Defending Democracy from Disinformation conferences, all sponsored by the foreign policy blob, about how do we create organizations that can kill the revenue of alternative news. So people are forced in Clockwork Orange style to only read mainstream media, which is intermediated by the Pentagon and the CIA. How can we make sure they only get government narratives and there is no opposition? And what they decided at that time, in early 2017, is when they started having these planning meetings, was that you have to look. This is why I started calling it the censorship industry. This wasn't my concept. They said you need to stop looking at alternative news as being about alternative news stories. You have to look at it as an industry of alternative news. And by the time it gets to the story, it's too late for us to stop it. There's too many stories for us to kill. But there's a much smaller number of institutions. And if we kill the messengers, there's way fewer messengers than messages. So we have to create an industry to kill their own industry of messengers. So they created a censorship industry to kill the alternative news industry. And NewsGuard was one of the first crops of that. They had something called Project Owl out of Google. They had something called the Trust Project. And then NewsGuard sort of grew out of this Trust Project, Trustmark thing. It was immediately working with the national security state right out the gate. In fact, its board of advisors is Michael V. Hayden, who's the former head of the CIA, former head of the NSA, and a four-star general. Tom Ridge, the former head of DHS. Rick Stengel, the former head of the censorship office of the State Department, the Global Engagement Center. And Anders Fogh Rasmussen, who's the former head of NATO for the entirety of the Obama administration. So you have NATO, the CIA, the NSA, the military, the State Department, and the DHS, all making the decisions on censorship for this middleware censorship organization, who they're plotting to be the middle-out intermediator. So essentially, you're going to have this crop. They want to create a competitive industry of middleware so that it's not just NewsGuard, it's a bunch of NewsGuard clones. So you, the user, have the illusion of choice. You get to pick which middleware provider censors you, but your pick is going to be between, CIA cutout 1, CIA cutout 2, CIA cutout 3. In fact, my Foundation for Freedom Online, is about to drop a 3-part series on exactly how this thing was concocted and what their plan for it is. So there's much more coming on this in the coming weeks.
So how does the middleware work? Is the middleware going to be something that's embraced by the tech platforms, and so they'll just communicate with all these former, intel officers like you were describing, and deep state actors about, here's NewsGuard recommending what should be censored, and then the social media companies adopting their recommendations? Or is it a user interface where users are going to be tasked with choosing one of these middleware companies? You have to choose one, you have to put some sort of safeguard on your account, and you have to choose one, and it's a Hobson's choice. It's a choice without a choice. This is the way they get you to opt into the censorship.
That's an amazing observation, because they're literally beta testing those two options right now. In fact, in the series that my foundation is about to drop, they actually go through a UI, a user interface for middleware, for different middleware providers, where you literally, you toggle on the basis of which censorship infrastructure you've committed to, and they even go through examples of, like, of vaccine hesitant posts. Somebody saying, "Hey, I don't think vaccines work," and you have a choice between a NewsGuard UI or a proprietary New York Times middleware option that either censors the post so you don't see it in the feed, or attaches a fact check label to it, needs more context, or has it be not visible, but you can turn on the visibility because it's said to be misleading. So all these different censorship options, depending on what the platform has selected or what the user has selected, they're basically hemming and hawing about how much choice to give users in this and how to make it fully funded. Because the issue is right now, they're afraid that the industry can't sustain itself financially. And so they're trying to figure out whether they can compel the platforms to pay the middleware providers directly, or whether to have a congressional bill force companies to pay for it. You can't have, by the First Amendment, Congress and the executive branch can't force the tech companies to censor something, but they could force them into a compliance regime where they need to pick between different censorship options.
Right.
And so right now, California just passed a media literacy bill that does that at the education level. They are forced now to fund censorship in high school and K through 12 educational programs. This is mandatory funding to censorship professionals in every public school in California. They are in the process of jimmy-rigging the legislative branch to coerce an industry into existence. Again, they are on tape, and you'll see this all in the coming weeks when my foundation drops it. They are on tape complaining that this industry can't exist as a free market on its own, so it needs to be propped up by government to either have government funding directly, or to force the tech companies to pay for the censorship services, either out of their corporate social responsibility funds, or forced basically contracting with them.
That media literacy mandate, and you mentioned California, same thing in my home state of Illinois. That's the same thing that has been passed there, to your point about what's afoot at the state level. And, in addition to that, anything at the federal level, you know how they're going to pitch it, right? Or this would be my suggestion. Let me get your reaction. I mean, this is going to be to provide for safety online. Safety online is the way that they'll pitch these middleware providers, or these whether it's on the consumer side or whether it's on the provider side. But this is all to provide for everyone's safety online and preserve our democracy and preserve free expression. This is all going to be sold as the preservation. Censorship is going to be sold as the preservation of free expression and safety online. Am I right?
Yeah, they've got that, and they have a whole menu of other ones. As soon as they reinflate, rent a RussiaGate, they're going to say, well, it's also to stop Russian disinformation. They're also going to say, it's to save democracy. They're also going to say, that sometimes they're so bold to just straight up say it's to stop fake news and misinformation. They have a whole panoply of predicates, and basically the civil war within the GOP has made it so politically neutered that they've been ineffective at stopping any of these predicates, as they are basically marched to the political poorhouse, because now there's the federal government they sit in is being weaponized to censor their ability to win future elections. I mean, if they don't wake up now, they're going to be in a coma the rest of their political lives.
Well, I mean, if you had even just a couple of enterprising politicians, I mean, some that have paid attention to this, although again, no action's been taken. The names don't even matter. But what is somebody who's hearing this and maybe understands this, maybe has understood it for a long time if they have access to what was going on that the public didn't until recently? What would you suggest that they do? I mean, I mentioned at the outset, Robert Epstein says Google should disclose all of its algorithms that produce the search results. I mean, that's one little thing, but are there big things that you think the Republican Party should undertake in response to this, essentially codification of a censorship industrial complex? What does that look like? What should the response look like?
The House Appropriations Committee could basically kill all of this with a series of well-placed riders. These riders could just basically defund, not allow appropriations in the budget to any number of federal programs at the National Science Foundation, at the State Department, at the Pentagon, at the FBI, at DHS, at HHS, at the FDA, all of their censorship programs and all these federal organizations, and they could all be killed with a single rider line for all of their programs. The issue is the Republicans are torn between the blob itself and their own constituents, and obviously they need to be educated to be able to identify them. But I've worked with 8 different congressional committees in the past 18 months, and a lot of it is quite frustrating because while many folks mean well, there's sort of a goldfish memory thing if there's not political pressure on it, and also because the censorship industry has successfully created this Rolodex of jargon terms, you need to constantly re-explain things, and because there are these high ticket items like the ongoing war in Ukraine, and now you've got this what's popped off in the Middle East, and then you've got things around the Justice Department just with the criminal things. To get censorship to be that big ticket item that a sufficient quorum of congressional actors can even dedicate the time to have the requisite education. I mean, this is why it's so important for the media to do this work, to make it unavoidable, to make it such an important issue that you can't avoid it, and that you almost pick up the education by osmosis of just reading the daily news. That's certainly been a big part of my daily life for the past 18 months. But what I'd say is, that's part of the service that shows like yours do. Sometimes people mean well, and they even want to do well, but things just slip. Things fall off the radar. And again, this is why social media freedom is so important, because oftentimes the motivation to do it depends on having, a social media mob that's creating the pressure and even giving you, both on the stick side of, hey, you're failing us, you should be more like this other senator, and on the carrot side, because you want to give your elected representatives a reason to be a hero. And that requires making noise about the issue so that they feel the magnanimity of swooping in to sponsor and build a coalition for the appropriate bills.
But even if House Republicans, for example, use the power of the purse with respect to these agencies, as you described, you still have the tech companies that are dominated by the left, with the exception of Twitter or X. They could still do what, of their own volition, what the government otherwise wants them to do. I mean, again, they don't need to be told what to do, just like the board of directors at NewsGuard doesn't need to be told what to do. They know what their agenda is. So is there, even if, again, the power of the purse strings was exercised by House Republicans, don't we still have potentially the same problem with big tech titans deciding to do this themselves?
Not really. I mean, not nearly to the same degree. I mean, with the exception of Google, I don't think there's a single tech company that wanted to do what it's been forced to do over the past 5-6 years. I mean, a great example of this is Twitter 1.0. Jack Dorsey said months after he banned Trump that he thought it was a mistake and that he only did it because it was a business decision. And it was a business decision because the government was on the verge of breaking up the company and was using, and you had these government cutouts like EIP and this whole State Department funded NGO swarm putting the pressure on Twitter and leading these ad boycotts of Twitter that were devastating the company's revenue line, and that they just like in the Jewish high holy day of Passover, they basically put the lamb's blood on the door so the angel of death passes over. This is what these tech companies were doing to satisfy government pressure. They were censoring the populist opposition to the deep state so that the deep state's angel of death would pass over them. That's what drove the censorship decision making at Twitter. That's what drove it at Facebook in large part. That's what drove it in large part at Microsoft. I would say Google was the only one who gleefully did it. They're sort of a special case. But no, I in fact, and we know this also because my Foundation for Freedom Online just posted a long report last week about how Yoel Roth, who was the head of censorship for Twitter 1.0, and a bunch of his censorship insider cohorts were complaining that that the private tech companies, with the government substantially off their back with a lot of this counter pressure in the past 18 months, that even companies like Facebook are now resorting to pre-2020 levels of information control, and that they're allowing various things in their own terms of service that were not allowed in the 2020 election. And what can we do to reinflate government pressure to bring them back into the fold? So we know there is mean reversion towards some modicum of internet freedom without government pressure. And, right now the blob is trying to reassert that ahead of 2024.
Well, I know that you're over the target with what you've been discussing, not just because of the intricacy of your knowledge, not just because this has now been confirmed by reporters like Shellenberger and Taibbi and others, but also because you're now a target of the DC press corps. I saw the hit piece that NBC News ran on you last month, calling you now you're a member of the alt-right because right, did I have that right? I just want to give you the chance to respond to that because what's Nancy Pelosi? She explained the wrap-up smear. So now you're the target of wrap-up smears. So you must be saying something that they don't like.
It's completely ridiculous. I mean, they try to call me an anti-Semite when I'm as Jewish as you can possibly be. I should be posting my bar mitzvah pictures in response. I was essentially de-radicalizing people, years ago, and this is all out of context. I don't want to say too much about that particular thing because I may be filing defamation lawsuits, and I'd rather leave this to my lawyers. But yes, I mean, this is not the first time the media has come after me for things. The Washington Post came at me a year ago for exposing DHS censorship. The New Yorker just mentioned me 12 times in an article about how the censorship industry is under siege by coordinated free speech pressure. So I mean, look, I hang all of these in my trophy wall. This is this is to be expected, and it's like we talked about previously. They can't stop the message, so they try to shoot the messenger.
The irony, too, of the Fourth Estate, right, as enshrined in our First Amendment, running interference for the censorship industrial complex. That irony is completely lost on them, but this is where we're at in America. Mike Benz, he's the founder of the Foundation for Freedom Online, former State Department official. Fascinating. Really appreciate your time and distilling all this for us. So helpful, and appreciate your continued work trying to drive this as a major issue, as the major issue it should be. Thanks again for your time. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, and thanks for spreading the word.
Please like this video and subscribe to this channel if you haven't already. And please leave a comment in the comment section. We'd love to hear your thoughts.